Previously, we've seen that English requires speakers to indicate when the things they are referring to are singular or plural, as well as whether or not they think the people they are talking to will be able to uniquely identify the things they are talking about. In other words, marking nouns for number and definiteness is obligatory in English. We also saw that not all languages require their speakers to do this. All languages do, however, require their speakers to make some things explicit, some of which are different than in English. A very cool feature of some languages is that their grammars require speakers to indicate how they came to know the information they assert. One of these languages is Tuyuca, spoken in Colombia and Brazil. In Tuyuca, speakers are required to end their verbs with suffixes that tell the listener who is doing the action, if the action is completed or ongoing, and if the speaker learned what she is asserting by seeing it, sensing it some other way, inferring it from circumstances, learning it from someone else, or if it's just something everyone knows. For example, both of these Tuyuca sentences mean, he is chopping trees. This is the part that means trees, and this is the part that means chop. The bits attached to the end of chop provide the information about who's doing the chopping and whether or not it's currently happening. And they also tell the listener how the speaker came by this information. So this first sentence tells the listener not only that some male is currently chopping trees, but also that the speaker knows this because she hears him. The second sentence tells the listener not only that someone is chopping trees, but also that the speaker knows this because she sees him. In this language, changing the suffixes on verbs changes the person doing the action, the time and nature of the action, and the information about how the speaker came to know what he is asserting. There are about as many possible suffixes as there are different combinations of that information. Here are some of them. To get a feel for how this works, let's pretend that we had to do this in English. If, for example, you wanted to tell someone that Sally went to the store, which suffix would you put on went? Since Sally is the person doing the action, and since Sally is probably female, you would need to pick one of the suffixes from this row. But which one? It depends on how you know that Sally went. Suppose you know this because someone told you. That means the suffix would come from this column. The suffix which indicates both that the subject is female and that I know this because someone told me is yigo. So yigo gets attached to the end of the verb. Now suppose you want to tell someone that John went to the store, and the way that you know this is that you heard him drive off. Once again, you would indicate this with the suffix on the verb. Since John is the subject this time, your choice would need to be one of those that says a single male is doing the action. It would also have to come from the group of suffixes that indicate that your assertion is based on what you heard. The suffix which conveys both of these bits of information is T. Now suppose you ran across this sentence. How would you interpret it? This time, the suffix on the verb tells you that the subject of the verb is they, and that the speaker thinks everyone is aware of this and should agree with his assessment. The suffix also tells you that the event has already happened. To express all of this in regular English requires the addition of several words. English needs to add a separate pronoun to express the subject, and an additional clause to express the basis for the speaker's assertion. However, like Tuyuca, English uses the past form of the verb to show that the action is already accomplished. Can you imagine having to figure out which of these suffixes to use every time you say something? Tuyuca kids learn to do this without even thinking about it. If you find that intimidating, remember that you learn to speak a language that requires you to decide whether or not the person you're talking to can uniquely identify every noun you mention in every sentence you say. And you can do that without thinking about it too. Language and the human mind are amazing things. Even when different languages require speakers to make the same kinds of distinctions explicit, tools they provide for this purpose are often different from each other, or at least used differently. Like English, thousands of languages rely on word order to indicate which part of a sentence is the subject and which is the object. Unlike English, though, In many languages, the subject does not come first in the sentence, but somewhere else. In many languages, the verb comes after the object, and in others, it's the first thing in the sentence. There are also languages that use strategies other than word order as the primary tool for indicating which part of the sentence is the subject, which is the object, and which parts take other roles. Latin and ancient Greek are two of these languages. In these languages, each noun has a suffix that indicates both number and case, case being the feature that provides the biggest clue to the role the noun is playing in the sentence. For example, the first word in both of these Latin sentences means dog, and the last word means cat. But the first sentence means the dog sees the cat, and the second sentence means the cat sees the dog. This is because it is the endings of the nouns, and not the order in which they occur, that indicates which animal is doing the seeing and which one is being seen. Here, the is ending on canis and the es ending on felis indicate that they are subjects, and the em endings of these words indicate that they are objects. While subjects and objects in these sentences are the same regardless of their position, that doesn't mean that these sentences mean exactly the same thing. Languages can use changes in word order for a wide range of functions, such as showing emphasis, contrast, or introducing new participants. Exactly what should be inferred will depend on the language being spoken and the context of each sentence. These changes to our Latin example would put emphasis on whatever word comes first. It is not only the order of elements of sentences that varies from language to language. The order of components of paragraphs, arguments, and stories can be different too. For instance, in English, we are most likely to make an assertion first and then mention the points that support it. In other languages, it is more natural for people to state the supporting points first and then conclude with what those points support. While many languages will have a preferred order, but can tolerate a different one, some languages only allow one, and using the other makes no sense at all. Just as word order has different functions in different languages, languages use prosody differently as well. We saw earlier how English uses prosody for emphasis or to change the mood of a sentence, and how in Mandarin, prosody is used to distinguish one word from another. In Batanga, spoken in Cameroon, changes in tone, that is, in the melody with which words are pronounced, can change both the meaning of words and the tense of verbs. For example, depending on the tone, this sentence can mean, he's climbing down the ladder, he will climb down the ladder, he's stealing the ladder, or he will steal the ladder. The change in verb tense is conveyed by changing the pitch of the first syllable of the verb, and the change in meaning is conveyed by changing the pitch of the second syllable. If the tone of the first syllable is low, the verb is in present tense, and if it is high, it is future. If the tone of the second syllable is high, the verb means steal, but if it is low, it means climb. In video 17, we saw how English uses verb tense both to distinguish between different kinds of messages and to distinguish between different kinds of information in a single message, such as setting background material apart from the events that constitute the progress of a story. While all languages use grammar to make these kinds of distinctions, both the exact nature of the distinctions being made and the tools used to make them can be very different in different languages. In French, for example, there are two past tenses that can be used to tell a story. One of these is the one you would use when telling about something that happened during your day, or when writing a letter to a friend. The other kind of past tense is found almost exclusively in written texts, and is used to recount everything from historical events to fairy tales. An important difference between them is that using the first one implies that the person using it has some personal involvement with what is being recounted, and using the second one implies that he doesn't. When translating a text that uses either of these verb forms into English, a translator will almost certainly use the English past tense. Doing so, however, requires that information about the original author's relationship to the text is no longer obvious from the grammar, but is left implicit. Similarly, when translating from English to French, the translator must choose which French past tense form to use. thereby making explicit in the French translation something that had been left implicit in the English original. Where does the information that guides the translator's choice of which form to use come from? It has to be from what he knows or assumes about the circumstances in which the original text was produced, rather than from the text itself. In video 17, we saw that English uses verb tense to indicate which parts of a story portray sequential events in the story's progression, and which recount events that happen apart from the main sequence. We saw that in a typical story, the events that make up the sequential backbone of the story are conveyed by verbs in the past tense, with verbs in the other tenses conveying other kinds of information. In many languages, the continuity of a story is signaled through the use of other devices. Some languages, including many spoken in Papua New Guinea, use something called a tailhead construction for this purpose. In some versions of this approach, verb tense does not indicate which events form the backbone of a story. Instead, sequential continuity is indicated by repeating the main verb of a sentence at the beginning of the following one. Listeners infer that verbs that are not repeated in this way have other functions in the story. If English used this approach, a story might look like the version on the right, with most of the verbs that move the story forward being repeated. While a story structured like this might seem slow and cumbersome to English speakers, especially those of us accustomed to the accelerated pace of modern media, this structure is normal in the languages that use it and tells native speakers which of the events being described are sequential steps in a coherent narrative and which are not. Telling a story in these languages without the repeated verbs is unnatural and would be similar to telling a story in English using only participles, where distinction between circumstance, purpose, and sequential event is lost. Translations of English texts into these languages require that the verbs of the main story be repeated, with the result that the translated text can be 50% longer than the English original. When translating from one of these languages into English, should the translator remove the repeated words to make the text sound more like normal English, or leave them in to reflect the structure of the original text? In the next video, number 22, we'll wrap up our brief treatment of language differences, touching on some of the strategies that different languages use to modify nouns and verbs.